the registration of the today's session. So in this way you can either review it or you can also share with other people interested. The next session is on the privacy risk assessment. We have here the Dr. Matthias Schmidl. He's the Deputy Austrian Data Protection Authority Director. And we are very happy to have him here, and he will provide us some information on how to conduct a risk assessment for privacy. So I give the floor to Mr. Schmidl.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm aware that the session right after lunch is usually the most difficult one. I will try to make it as interesting as possible for you. Now, we will shift a little bit away from air safety and air security now, so the points that usually are connected with the operation of UAS, and we will put our focus in this presentation a little bit more on data protection, and I will also try to point out how the rules on data protection actually match and interfere with the rules on the operation of UAS. Now, as I have pointed out here on this slide, the main focus on the rules of UAS lies on operational and air safety. It's quite clear. So the speaker before me in the morning rightly said one of the most important aspects is nobody wants to get hit by a drone, either because this person is in an aircraft himself, or either the person is on the ground. The main focus of the general data protection regulation lies on the protection of personal data of natural persons, and this is of course a different focus, but nevertheless it has implications on the operation of unmanned aircraft systems. Now, some facts about the GDPR. It's a regulation. It's applicable since the 25th of May 2018, so quite recently. As you can see, it's an EU regulation, which means that in a European matter, it's directly applicable in all member states, although there are some opening clauses for the member states to regulate one aspect or another. But in general, most provisions of the GDPR, and in particular those provisions that concern perhaps you, are directly applicable and cannot be changed and altered by the member states. Now, where and why does the GDPR apply? It applies first of all to all processing operations, data processing operations, and if I speak of data, then I mean data of natural persons. Yeah? And it applies to all processing operations in the context of the activities of an establishment, of a controller or processor in the European Union. Now, if a controller or a processor has an establishment in the EU, and if within the context of this establishment personal data are processed, then the GDPR is applicable. What is a controller? A controller is the person or the legal person or the entity that decides to process personal data. So it's more or less the lord of the data, the one that takes the decision to process personal data, and the one who is ultimately responsible for the correct and lawful processing of the data. A processor is someone who can be relied on to process data on behalf of the controller. So for example, if a controller decides to outsource certain data processing operation, it can be done, but it can be done, and the processor can do it, but nevertheless the controller is still ultimately responsible for the correct processing of personal data, and also liable if there are any complaints or actions for damage. The GDPR also applies to all processing operations by a controller or processor not established in the EU, where the processing is related to the offering of goods or services or the monitoring of the behavior of data subjects as far as their behavior takes place within the European Union. Now, the mere fact that a processor or a controller does not have an establishment in the EU does not mean that the GDPR is not applicable. Since the EU is quite an important market, and since any relevant undertaking not established in the EU is nevertheless interested to sell goods or services to persons in the EU, the General Data Protection Regulation is more or less worldwide applicable. And those processors and those controllers that do not have an establishment in the European Union, are obliged to nominate a representative in the European Union who serves as a point of contact for the supervisory authorities. Now, the GDPR is quite long. It has 173 recitals and 99 articles, so I'm not going to talk about all that. I will just focus on a few aspects. The most important points for you and the most important points for the operation of unmanned aircraft system you can find in Chapter 4. And Chapter 4 contains the duties of controllers and processors. One of the most important points is that all those duties can be enforced by the competent supervisory authority. So in each member state of the European Union, you have at least one supervisory authority responsible for enforcing the provisions of the GDPR. So for example, in Austria, you have one. In Germany, you have several, so one on the federal level and then one on for each Bundesland. But nevertheless, at least one supervisory authority is responsible for enforcing those provisions. And the most important aspect is that operators of UAS may be parties to proceedings before the supervisory authorities. Yeah? And one of the main aspects of the GDPR, and this is why the GDPR became so relevant during the last few months, is that for non-compliance, high administrative fines can be imposed. Yeah? So I put it out here. So the administrative fines for non-compliance with the provisions of Chapter 4 are up to 10 million euro, or in the case of an undertaking, up to 2% of the total worldwide annual turnover of the preceding financial year, whichever is higher. So depending on the circumstances of each specific case, an administrative fine could also be higher than 2 million euro. Yeah? So the bottom here are 2% of the total worldwide annual turnover. Yeah? And this, as I've already said, was the reason why the GDPR was so interesting during the last few months and also gained worldwide knowledge. I would like to highlight two duties that are in particular interesting for the operation of UAS. This is one duty is privacy by design and privacy by default, as enshrined in Article 25 of the GDPR. The GDPR follows a risk-based approach concept, so quite similar to the rules on air safety here with drones. And privacy by design and privacy by default actually oblige a controller to incorporate the rules on data protection and on privacy right on from the beginning when a processing operation is in fact developed. So a controller is actually obliged to think about what kind of data do I need that amount of data, what kind of data security measures can I take to mitigate some risks, and so on and so forth. And the second duty that I would like to highlight here is the data protection impact assessment, also known as privacy impact assessment. And here you have, of course, some matching points, so to say, with the operation of drones, where also a risk assessment needs to be carried out in certain cases. Now, what is a DPIA? A DPIA is a process which is designed to describe the processing, assess its necessity and proportionality, helps to manage the risks to the rights and freedoms of natural persons resulting from the processing of personal data by assessing them and determining the measures to address them. This is more or less what a DPIA is, and if I understand that the process, the concept of a risk assessment, as it will be presented here this afternoon, correctly, then I think the process is quite similar, although the object or the objective is a little bit different. But the process as such is not so different. What is the goal of a DPIA? The goal of a DPIA is to identify, analyze, estimate, evaluate, treat, mitigate, and review regularly risks from the point of view of a data subject. So this is, as I've said, one of the crucial points of a DPIA, and one of the points that makes the general data protection, or that makes the data processing impact assessment different from similar procedures in other areas of law. At the center of attention is the natural person and its expectations and his and her rights under the GDPR. So if a DPIA is to be carried out, it must be carried out from the point of view of a data subject. Data security measures are fine. They are mostly in the center of attention if a DPIA is carried out in elsewhere. But here, under the GDPR, it must be done from the point of view of a data subject. So, what does the GDPR say about the DPIA? Article 35 says very clearly that a DPIA shall, so there's no choice, it must, yeah? So a DPIA shall be carried out where a type of processing, in particular using new technologies and taking into account the nature, scope, context and purpose of the processing, is likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural person. So, as I've already said, that the focus of a DPIA are natural persons and their rights and freedoms. And the GDPR says quite clearly, it is the controller that has to make the first step. It is the controller who has to decide, do I need a DPIA, yes or no? So this is the first decision that the controller has to take, and this is the decision that only the controller can take. Yeah? So no supervisory authority and no other authority can take this decision instead of a controller. But of course there are some guidelines to help a controller to find out whether something is related with a high risk or not. The GDPR also provides for a special procedure if a DPIA is carried out, and if the result of a DPIA is that the processing is likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons, and if those risks cannot be mitigated by technical means. In these cases, Article 36 of the GDPR provides that the controller must consult the national or the local supervisory authority, and then a consultation procedure is launched, and the national supervisory authority can issue recommendations on how processing operations can be brought into line with the GDPR, but the national DPA may also say, for example, this processing operation cannot be brought into line with the GDPR, let it be. There's also a possibility. I've already mentioned that there are some guidelines for controllers, just so that a controller can find out whether something is related to high risk, yes or no. First of all, the competent supervisory authorities are obliged to make public a list of the kind of processing operations which are subject to the requirement for a DPIA. So what I can tell you now is that most DPAs in Europe are already preparing those lists. They must go through the European Data Protection Board for an opinion, and this will be done in September most likely. So I think in autumn and winter you can expect the first list to be published by the national DPAs. And if you have a look at the list, if you have a look at the list of your DPA, and if you find the processing operation that you intend to do is on this list, then you are obliged to carry out a data protection impact assessment. On the other hand, the competent supervisory authorities may also make public a list of those kind of processing operations for which no DPIA is required, the so-called white lists. So there's no obligation to make public those lists, it's a possibility. In Austria we have already published those lists, and the next one, as I've said, the blacklist will be published probably in September, October. So here you have a graph just to visualize, I hope you can see it in the last row, how to visualize a little bit DPIA and its concept under the GDPR. So first of all, you have to decide whether the processing operation is likely to result in a high risk. If no, then no data protection impact assessment is needed. If yes, then you have to look whether there's an exception for carrying out the data protection impact assessment. If you have no exception, then a data protection impact assessment must be carried out. And in certain cases, you are required to consult the national supervisory authorities after having carried out a DPIA. So, what does it have to do with UAS? First of all, you have, and as it has already been mentioned, this draft Commission regulation laying down the rules and procedures for the operation of unmanned aircraft. And if you look at the annex, you will find in subpart B provisions on operational risk assessment and the factors that need to be taken into account when carrying out an operational risk assessment. And there in paragraph 2, letter H, you also have to take care of the privacy risks. So when you have to carry out an operational risk assessment according to this draft Commission regulation, then you have to take into account the privacy risks as well. And there you have the direct link more or less between this legal act and the GDPR. But even if those point was not mentioned in the draft Commission regulation, as I've already said, the GDPR is already applicable since the 25th of May. There's nevertheless a direct obligation to carry out a DPIA before you start with a processing operation in certain cases. As I have already said, it's the duty of a controller, and one single data protection impact assessment can be carried out for assessing multiple operations that are similar, which means that a DPIA can be prepared by a product provider, but it must be carried out by the controller, and the controller will in most cases be the operator, or in the private sector perhaps also the pilot, who is at the same time the operator. The Article 29 Working Party, which is now the European Data Protection Board, has issued guidelines on the DPIA and how to determine whether something is likely to result in a high risk. For the purpose of the General Data Protection Regulation, you can find the guidelines here, and those guidelines, they contain links to recognize DPIA methodologies. So there are methodologies, some DPAs have already developed them. For example, the British Information Commissioner has developed a methodology, the French CNIL has developed a methodology for data protection impact assessment. So if you would like to know more about these methodologies, you should have a look at those guidelines that are very useful and that are available in all official languages of the European Union. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I could clarify a few things. And if you have some questions, please feel free to ask me. Thank you.
Yeah, before we move to the questions, we can show a presentation by DG Grow on privacy.
Oops. Yes, thank you. This is just now that you may be a bit worried about this subject, which is normally for drone operator not the most favorite and not the most let's say on what you focus, you may feel a bit lost. And the good news is that DG Grow, to support the industry, is funding a project that would deliver tools to help you to cope with these requirements. You already heard that there are some guidelines available, but we want to provide you more specific guidelines for drone operation and some other useful tools. So this project will feed its results into the dronerule.eu website that some of you may already know, and I would encourage you to consult it. It has some elements on safety, privacy, and insurance. And this new project will reinforce the privacy dimension, so a number of new tools will be provided there. Exactly to answer what Dr. Schmittel said, the GDPR requirements. There will be two sets of tools. First, an e-learning course that should allow drone operators, pilots, and manufacturers to better understand what privacy and data protection issues may be covered by their operation. I think this is probably quite necessary because most of the operators are focusing on their businesses. They are not, except in some cases, interested by people around, but it's not because you eventually control a power line that you may not eventually take pictures from people in their garden, for instance. And of course, you don't focus on these people, but in this case, you have actually captured personal data and some obligation falls on you. So this e-learn tool is, I think, very useful, and it will be developed in the next year. There will be a number of live training in March, July next year to really finalize the tool, and then it will be released online. And I would really invite you to use it, because this privacy and data protection culture should really be built in the drone business, because this would really, I think, support the acceptance by citizens. And again, it's not only to comply with the legal obligation under the GDPR, which exists sometimes, that it was very clearly explained, but sometimes you may not necessarily fall under a very specific obligation under a GDPR, but more broadly, privacy, I think, is a concept which is very important. If you see a drone flying over your garden, you may not know if the camera is switched on or off, or if there is a camera or not. Even there is no camera, you may feel attacked, I would say, in your privacy. That means that for the drone operator, this kind of thing need to be taken into account to really be accepted as a business. Even there is no legal obligation, because the legal obligation of data protection comes only when there is effectively a collection and a processing of a personal data. The toolbox will provide specific tools to comply with some of the requirements of the GDPR. A privacy impact assessment, a code of conduct that was mentioned, I think, some pre-flight checklist, and privacy by design guide, targeting drone operator, pilot, and manufacturers. A few quick words on the privacy or the data protection impact assessment. So the project has already delivered a PDF document which is under finalization, consultation with some national authorities and some industry. This will be turned into a tool or an app, and I hope, frankly speaking, that the SORA one day will also be turned into an app or a tool that you can also process or the analysis in more easy way. But that's the idea here. We will, or this project will issue a specific template for performing the DPIA for drone, and it will be turned into an app. Today, it is a broader approach which has been taken. It covers not only data protection but privacy, and a focused version on the data protection. So the DPIA imposed by the GDPR will also be provided. So as it was mentioned, it's a very classical approach. Privacy impact assessment, like the SORA, looks at basically first, do you need it? Then identify your operation, identify the data flow. This is very important in this context. Data flow is the critical element here. And then identify if you have personal data there. And then you look at the mitigation, first at the risk and the mitigation measures, and you finalize your analysis. This analysis, as I said, on one side may help you, and I think this is why I think it's good that it is done much more often than just when it is strictly obligatory under the GDPR, because it provides you really solution to have an acceptable, let's say, and a responsible way of operating drones. And of course, it can also serve as proof that you have complied with the data protection requirement when it is required. Something which is interesting, but then no, the second element, it was mentioned as well, is the privacy by design guidelines. This is more for the manufacturers to address a number of issues. First of all, manufacturers have also to integrate in their design the concept of privacy by design. But beyond that, they may also provide some function to help the operator to comply with some of its own requirements, like the requirement to be transparent, for instance, providing information about the processing which is occurring. I will not go further in the details, but this will also be available and not fully useful for manufacturers. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that the GDPR also foresees the possibility that industry sectors develop some specific code of conduct. And again, the project will here develop one for drone operations. This may support also the obligation under the GDPR, provided that this code of conduct is approved by a supervisory authority at national level or even the European authority. Here I eventually launch a call to industry. the last process of getting this approved must be done by the industry. The project here cannot do it because they are consultant mainly. If industry association in the future have an interest to eventually look at that code of conduct and appropriate the code of conduct and perform, let's say, the next step to get it approved, we would be very happy to support that, and you can contact the Commission DG GROW if you want to appropriate your, let's say, and provide that to your member. Okay, I wanted just to show you that some of these tools will come in the next months. Everything will be available next year, and that should hopefully help you to comply with the requirement of the GDPR that have been presented by Dr. Schmittel, and even take more broadly, let's say, the concept of privacy and the respect of citizens full into account when you developed further your drone operation.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. So you can either provide question using Slido, Slido is still open, or we can accept a question here on the floor. Is there any question on the privacy risk assessment? Okay.
I have a question for Dr. Schmidl. You said Austria has adopted the list that should or should not. Drones, are there in there?
Thank you very much. Now, as I've already said, we have already adopted a whitelist, and due to Austrian legal requirements, it had to be adopted as a regulation, as an interstate regulation. Drones as such are not specifically mentioned, so we did not target specific operations. We tried to keep it as general as possible, so this is our approach. And as I've already said, the blacklist is under consideration. It will be sent to the European Data Protection Board for an opinion, and we hope that the EDPB will give us a favorable opinion on our project. But here again, we tried to keep it as general as possible, and we did not focus on drones, aircraft, or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
There was the pillar in front.
Thank you, Matthias. Have you heard about Helsinki? In Helsinki, we had a summit about drones with the European Commission together, and there was a very, very interesting study made by a Danish university. And you can have the copy of this if you're interested. And but the outcome was interesting because you mentioned this as well during your little speech, what was really appreciated, that the public, they are seeing the drones or the UAS in a different way. When they see it, when they hear it, and the noise is a very, very much disturbing item, I would say. And immediately when they hear a drone, they extrapolate that there is something. There's a camera inside, there's a microphone, there are some privacy. Although this study was very, very serious, done by the Danish university. I forgot the name. And if you're interested, but you can get this study, the outcome of the study, for maybe for your additional improvement or installation.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, telling from the practice, I can tell you that we had already several complaints against the use of drones. One of the major problems is, and the way I see it, this problem will be tackled by the new rules on drones, the identification of a drone operator. So if you see a drone, then you just see a drone, and normally you do not see the person behind the drone. But what we need as an authority to launch an investigation is we need to know the person or the entity behind that drone. The drone, the photo of a drone alone is not enough. And in this case, in this respect, we are very grateful for the new rules, which will provide for an obligatory identification system, which makes it quite easier also for us to launch procedures. Yeah, but as you said, you're right. Most people associate with drones air safety, of course, and most drones are equipped with cameras, and as soon as you have a camera, then you also process personal data, and you are within the ambit of the GDPR.
So no other question on the risk assessment for privacy? So this is something that we need to better understand once we start to put in place.
Thanks. Jürgen Lefebvre, I'm from the Swiss Model Aircraft Federation. We've talked a lot about data that's gathered in drone operations, but the draft rules or the basic regulation also requires the registration of operators. And we're looking at thousands of people that are going to be registering themselves in a registry that's going to be linked across EU member states that will contain quite a lot of data about those operators. There's quite a number of concerns we know among our members about the registration need. What guarantees are you going to be putting in place to protect the data of people that register themselves as operators of drones in the open category?
Thank you. So, if I understand your question, sorry, if I understood your question correctly, there will be an obligation to register for drone operators, and your question was how to make sure that those data of the drone operators are performed safely. Is this correct? Yeah. I must admit that I do not know who you have to register with. I suppose it's the national supervisor. It's the national, the National Authority on Aviation. Yeah. Well, in this case, of course, this authority is also bound by the GDPR and subject to the supervision of the Data Protection Supervisory Authority. And as any other controller, the national, even also authorities have to take the appropriate data security measures to process data safely. And if they do not comply with the requirements of the GDPR, they can also be subject to proceedings before the National Data Protection Authority. So there's no difference between the public and the private sector in that regard.